of asking the question, what's going to happen with college next semester and in the coming years? I'm assuming most of you are in the late stages of high school, where in a normal situation you would have been probably checking out and visiting campuses right around this time, if not have already chosen the university or college that you wanted to go to. Unfortunately, that's been severely disrupted this year, and in a way that doesn't seem to have a clear result yet, or a clear point of guidance going forward with what we're going to be dealing with next. But I want to try and offer you some advice on that and observations of where I think college is going over the next few months to years as we mitigate and deal with this massive disruption of the coronavirus. Including offering you some advice that I think may put you on a firmer footing on what this entails for a question that almost everyone has about going to college, even under normal set circumstances, and that is, how do I pay for it? How do I deal with a growing financial burden that is associated with university life? Because we all know that tuition was skyrocketing. It was going up at rapid, record-setting rates even before the coronavirus came along. And we don't exactly know what that's going to mean in the wake of this crisis, this event. But I want to offer you a little bit of advice to go through there. First, I want to talk, though, about the history even of how colleges and universities have dealt with pandemics and previous events in the past. Universities are some of the oldest institutions in the world. We know some of the well-known flagship universities in Europe go back almost 1,000 years. Think about places like the University of Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. And there are several schools on the continent as well that are old, tried and true institutions. And one of the aspects of that history is it also means that they've weathered pandemics before, and it's had interesting effects on them. Although that's changed over history. I do want to just briefly mention one major event that is often seen as one of the first globally disruptive economic events, because it swept across at least the known world, and that was the Black Death, the plague, the bubonic plague. It swept across all of the Asian continent and into Europe in the mid 14th century. From about 1347 to 51 was when it really ravaged and kind of reached the peak of death that was associated with it. It's a horrific event that took out roughly a third of the population total of Europe. So 1 in 3 people died from this based on the estimates that we have. And universities were caught in the middle of it. If you've seen that picture, that's a satirical dramatization of it from one of my favorite movies, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But it was about the plague cart where they were taking the bodies out. Not to be too grim, but universities in the 14th century responded to pandemics in a way that may have some precursors to today. If they were in a hard-hit town, as Oxford is the one that we have some of the best records on, first they shut down their classes, and really for about 3 years' time, we know from some of the records that exist about Oxford, they moved out to a country estate away from the city to get away from the plague. But that's not really so much of an option for the modern era. That's a period that predates our knowledge of germ theory. I do want to turn to what happened in the 20th century when we had pandemics hit. One that's been in the news a lot lately, you've probably seen as a point of comparison, this was the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, right on the tail end of World War I. And we know it because it's one of the first well-recorded pandemics after the theory of germs and the theory of virology had been demonstrated by science. So really prior to the end of the 19th century, we didn't have a good handle about what caused diseases and how they passed. There were a bunch of competing theories, but it was really only until scientific instruments allowed us to notice microorganisms and even smaller particles that are barely even on the register of life forms, which is viruses, were the root of all of these events. But that was known at the time of the Spanish flu. It was a particularly severe strain of influenza. And this is a photograph of a university coping with the Spanish flu. You may be looking at it, they're not necessarily socially distancing, but I want you to take a closer look at the photograph and the background. you'll start to notice this isn't a normal classroom. This is outdoors. This was the bleachers of a football stadium. And there was the professor with a chalkboard that he wheeled out onto the football field, giving his lecture to the students in their classes, watching from the bleachers. And the idea here was that disease was less transmissible in open circumstances outdoors than it was in a closed, confined lecture hall. So that was one of the ways that colleges and universities dealt with pandemics in the past. They also, when the pandemic would sweep through a specific city or a region, they would shut down the school, but they'd dismiss students for maybe like 2 to 3 weeks until the pandemic passed. It really wasn't a nationwide phenomenon. It was an ad hoc campus by campus by campus basis. So some schools never closed down, others closed down for short periods, others closed down for longer periods based on the situation. We had other pandemics in the 20th century. There were polio in the 1940s and 50s was a very severe disease until they discovered the vaccine and have really controlled it. But every now and then they'd have a recurring polio pandemic, and it would hit a town or a city. And what would campuses do? Well, they'd close down for a couple weeks until it passed. Or they adopted another strategy we don't see as much today, and that was to quarantine on campus, keep the students on campus, and prevent anyone from the outside world from coming in. That's what most schools did during the 1957 and 1968-69 flu epidemics that were particularly severe years. They had high death tolls and were regarded as very infectious. The typical responses were they'd quarantine on campus, shut down visitors from the outside, hold students in dorms. They canceled large events and sporting events. Some of them resumed that strategy of outdoor lectures. And then if it was really severe, they had short-term closures. One of the interesting stories that emerged, and this happened on several campuses, when they started quarantining students on campus, they noticed that there was an uptick of students leaving campus to just go home for the semester, and it actually cut into some of their business model and what was going on. That's why we had the picture of the hitchhiker. There was a famous news story that happened in the University of North Carolina in 1957, where they noticed a bunch of students were hitchhiking their ways out of town to escape the quarantine that was coming when there was a period of pandemic. So these are more modern responses than what we had in the Middle Ages, but still they're different from what we've seen in COVID. So what happened on campuses and colleges in response to the COVID-19 crisis? Here's a brief timeline. Some of you probably saw this play out in real time as you were considering planning campus visits and making decisions around that time. But we've now seen some of the data of it. And it kind of tells us what happened. Early March 2020, when it became evident that the coronavirus was a very severe disease, campuses across the United States and really across the world enacted closures. They decided to shut down for the remainder of the semester. Sometimes this was very hastily made decisions. Several schools around the country made the call to shut down for the coronavirus either a day or two before their students were set to leave for spring break, or some of them were already on spring break. You remember some of the kids partying down in Florida in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, at the same time, a lot of their colleges and universities were shutting down and clearing out their dorms for the long haul. There's been some academic work to explain why they did this. Two major factors emerge. It wasn't necessarily reflecting what was going on in that town or city in terms of a COVID outbreak, although some cities, as we've seen, are much more severe than others. Some states have not been hit at all or have been hit very, very lightly. So if you go into the rural states of the western United States, the Dakotas, parts of Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana have not been hit very hard, whereas New York City, which is a major university town in addition to being an economic center, was hit extremely hard. But state mandates ordered schools to close. And then also there was a follow the leader phenomenon that's been identified. When universities saw prominent campuses, elite institutions like Princeton and Harvard and Yale making the decision to shut down, they followed suit, which is often what happens in higher ed, irrespective of the data. By mid-March 2020, Almost all colleges and universities in the United States had switched to online education, online instruction. Something very similar to what we're doing right now with a webinar, but imagine this as your class 3 nights a week. Imagine this as your mechanism that you communicate with your professor. You're holding office hours online via a Zoom or Skype call. And you're turning in assignments online, which changes the dynamics of the classroom. There have been some opinion surveys on this, and what do you think students are saying about online education? It's not nearly as popular as in-person education. There's a widespread belief that you lose something from the classroom experience by going online, although it's seen right now, at least, as a coping mechanism for the worst part of the pandemic. The idea being that it's going to only last for a temporary period of time, and we're going to switch back to higher education in a more conventional fashion, hopefully by the beginning of the fall 2020 semester. But that's where we are hovering right now, is a state of uncertainty. Higher ed is talking about reopening, but it's also varying on a case-by-case basis, university by university basis. Some, such as the Cal State system, recently announced that they're probably staying online for all of the fall semester, although that could change because we know that this is a week-to-week or even day-to-day decision-making process. So what I would say is, based on the uncertainty we have right now, don't bank on anything to be certain in the fall. We just have a few predictions. The general route that most universities are talking about seems to be a partial or a condensed reopening. This might be something where they cut down the length of the semester from a full 3.5 months, or 16 weeks is roughly the normal length of a college semester, to maybe do it in 9 or 10 weeks and just have everyone go on break at Thanksgiving. The idea being that's the peak of the next flu season, which probably would be the peak of any COVID resurgence if it exists. So you don't want people bringing back the disease after they've gone home to visit their family and relatives on Thanksgiving. And the idea would be condense the semester and then you reopen sometime in late January or early February after the Christmas break and everything has taken place. So condensed schedules, it means changing some stuff around in the classroom. There's also a lot of talk about mixed formats where you take some of your classes online, the big massive lecture hall classes, and then you take your concentration, your major in person, and those are smaller classroom settings, which are perceived to be less risky. And then we're also having a widespread discussion among the faculty and administrators. There are quite a few faculty that so far are fairly resistant to reopening out of personal risk, and then other factors that they're considering. I'm not going to take a stance on what I would say to do in terms of reopening, but this is something that's probably going to determine most schools when and where they make the call to reopen. Differences with past pandemics, we've already been through some examples. COVID is unique and really historically unprecedented for a modern university to shut down for this long for a pandemic reason. They've shut down for other reasons. Anyone want to take a guess on that? If you're thinking war, World War II was the last example that there were widespread campus closures for more than a few weeks. But that was a very different reason, although it might tell us some guidance about what was going on then and what we might expect, because a lot of those campuses did rebound after the war. It just meant from about 1941 to 1945, they were on a very limited skeleton operation, or they basically eliminated their operations, put everything on suspension for 4 years while people were out fighting the war, mainly because a lot of students were of military age and were entering into the army to go fight fascism, to win the war itself, and resumed their education when they got back in 1946. The other unprecedented factor is we now have technology that previously did not exist until really about 10 years ago, and it hasn't really gotten very good at the technology until really about the last 4 or 5 years. So we are almost kind of lucky in that sense. Even though it's inferior to the classroom experience, according to most people, it at least is something that we can continue something of a normal education online. But then there's also a heavy political response that's been building up behind what higher ed is doing. That includes questions of financial strains on college operations. There's a major discussion playing out right now. Should universities with large endowments tap into those endowments to weather the storm? There, as I mentioned, some faculty are opposed to reopening. Then there's policy discussion. Should higher ed effectively be bailed out with the knowledge that it's going to take a hit in enrollments almost certainly in the fall as a result of this strange disruption? I want to talk to you a little bit about problems that existed in higher ed before the coronavirus pandemic even was on our radar, things that had been emerging for the past several decades, because these are financial considerations that you as students and prospective students are going to have to deal with regardless of there being a pandemic, but the pandemic has changed some of the problems that are associated with it. First one, and this is on almost everyone's mind, tuition and associated student debt to pay tuition has been skyrocketing for almost 2 decades. The cost of college has gone up at a faster rate than most other items in institutions in society. It's gone up at a much faster rate than say like inflation on the price of goods that you buy in the store. And it's done so in a relatively rapid pace. But it's also followed an increased reliance on taking on debt to pay for your 4 years in college, and almost everyone's worried about this. They're even talking about, should we have student debt relief or some sort of student debt bailout? This comes up in the political seasons all the time as a result of this problem of tuition going up. Well, what's been driving tuition going up? One of the big factors is the second bullet point here: administrative bloat, the growth of on-campus personnel and non-education related amenities that have been added to the college experience in the United States. And I actually have some data on that. That's what the chart shows here. This chart breaks down the 3 major categories of employment in colleges and universities in the US, and those are the faculty. That's the kind of orangish, reddish colored line. And you see it's gone up at a relatively steady pace. It's almost matched the growth directly of the number of students. So you can go all the way back to the 1970s up until today. Colleges like to maintain an overall rate of about 25 students per 1 full-time faculty. That's just been kind of the rule, the sweet spot, if you'll have it, of where colleges tend to operate. So that's grown at almost the exact rate of student enrollment. High-end administrators, so these are presidents, vice presidents, provost, executives, have also grown at roughly the same rate. That's the blue line down at the bottom, but it's a much smaller population. There's like 4 to 5 of these executives at every university. Unless it's a really large university, it may have many more than that. But these are the leadership executives, and they've grown roughly the same rate as colleges themselves. But something else has taken off, and that's the gray line here that you see in the middle that started out very low, 200,000 employees around 1976, and today there are 800,000 nationwide. There are in fact more people in this category than there are university faculty. These are the non-executive level, non-managerial level professional staff of the universities. These are people that run the admissions office, student services, dorms, food and dining halls, student sports, activities, you name it. There are hundreds of thousands of people that work in that dimension of higher ed that previously just did not exist as part of the college experience. And part of this has been a move to add other amenities in addition to college classroom instruction onto campus. That's taken off over the past 40 years or so. It's also put a big burden on the price tag of higher ed because someone has to pay for all those amenities and all the people that are employed doing them. In fact, there are the ratio of non-executive administrators to students is actually smaller than faculty to students at most campuses. There are more people that work in these professional capacities than there are actual faculty. And a lot of times these are people you'll never see or only see once or twice in your college experience. On top of that, we've had many ethical issues associated with the way that businesses conducted on campus. Some of you probably remember in the news about a year ago, there was a major scandal at several universities that were admitting the children of rich people, like actresses. So Aunt Becky on Full House just was involved in a legal case because she was involved in allegedly paying a university to buy spots for admission for her children. And there were 3 or 4 other major actors, famous people that got caught up in this. Elite, wealthy millionaires and billionaires were buying spots in colleges for their children through basically bribes and money under the table. That tells you something, that there were ethical problems being raised early on before COVID about how college did business. And then on top of that, there's also been growing differentiation of what a college major means. So a lot of stuff going on before COVID that was already there and would already be there in higher ed. It's going to be added into our mix of considerations, including advice that I'm going to try and give you on what to do to navigate the next few months or years of choosing what you want to do to get a college degree. I actually wrote a book on this called Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education, with Jason Brennan, my co-author at Georgetown University. Came out in the last year, and we discussed these exact issues, including the ways that colleges and universities game the ranking system, something you all probably have seen or paid attention to, the U.S. News and World Report rankings and other things like that. So this is a pressing issue that's been in the background of this discussion all before COVID. What else is going on in higher ed? And this is a little bit more related to the COVID crisis, because we are now probably in a fairly severe economic recession as a result of the lockdowns, as a result of this disruption that the coronavirus caused for our society. Well, what does this mean for higher ed? We can look a little bit to the last recession. This was 2008, 2009, the financial crisis. And it actually is not all that encouraging of a picture, because it shows 2 factors played out. The first one is this line at the very top of the chart. That was state appropriations, general appropriations to run public universities. And there's also all sorts of other appropriations in the mix here. Private universities sometimes get public funding as well, from the government through direct and indirect loans and grants and all sorts of things. But state funding of the state university systems during the last recession declined. And it dropped off from about 2008 to really 2013. There was a cut in inflation-adjusted billions of dollars that were spent on higher ed. And then it only reversed course around 2013 and kind of resumed its pre-recession level. So I'd expect that is probably going to happen again after the coronavirus problems shake out. So be on the lookout for that. And it's simply because everything is strained right now. We've cut our tax base. The economy contracted, it declined. It means there's less money to go around to spend on things that governments normally do, one of which is higher ed. But here's the oddity of the last recession. When states were cutting their higher ed budgets to deal with the economic downturn of the financial crisis, the federal government stepped in and rapidly ramped up Pell Grants, direct aid, other forms of funding to students to go to college. They did this for a very specific reason. Unemployment was severe in the last recession, and in order to take some of the strains off of the job market, to actually even discourage too many people from seeking too few jobs, because there weren't enough jobs to go around to employ everyone that wanted them, they basically paid and subsidized prospective students to either go to college or go back to college and get a second degree. And that's where all the funding for need-based and merit-based financial aid came from on the federal government. It was basically an unemployment relief strategy. The idea was that if you pay people to go to college, encourage them to go to college, they'll be out of the workforce for a couple of years because they're getting a degree, and then that gives us some time for the economy to recover. So this is a very conscious strategy that was adopted in 2008, played out over the next several years, and those programs are still more or less with us. Coronavirus is a little bit different because it affects college operations. And even though unemployment has returned as a problem to address, we have almost already spent that card from the last recession. So it's going to add some complexities to what we can do now. Going to college and what's the new normal under coronavirus? Well, first I want to talk to you a little bit about paying for college under any circumstance. This is a rough breakdown of what you can expect as an entering freshman straight out of high school going into college, on average for a typical university in the United States. This is an average taking from both public and private schools, four-year colleges and universities. First, tuition payment on average is roughly $20,000 a year. If you live on campus, your room, board, and fees, and your dorm and meal plans and all that stuff, you can basically expect to add another $20,000. There's a third category, and this is a hitch. This is something we think about as economists, but it's not always presented to you as an obvious component of the cost of higher education. And that's what economists refer to as opportunity cost, or in more colloquial terms, this is foregone income. So imagine instead of going to college in September, you decided you were just going to enter into the workforce. And maybe you do that as a minimum wage worker at McDonald's. You get a starting entry salary job. You can expect to maybe make $25,000 over the course of the next year for that. And it may not be a very fast career for advancement right off the bat, but you are at least making money. And you have to build that into your economic calculation here when you decide to go to college, because that foregone income is income that would have accrued otherwise if you went into the workforce, although this is kind of changing a bit when the workforce itself is being disrupted. So maybe foregone income is no longer as high as it used to be. But the gist of it, under normal circumstances, a typical college education on average would cost about $260,000 over 4 years. That's a lot of money for almost anyone. And it may be something you've saved for, it may be something your parents saved for. You could get scholarships or grants or aid toward it, or you could get student loans to pay it off. But one way or another, that's a lot of money. There are ways to lower that account. Some of you are probably seeing that price tag and saying, $260,000, I could buy a house for that in some parts of the country. Could live very well for that in some parts of the country. But it's not a full picture, because that, remember I said that includes private institutions, elite institutions like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, where you may be spending $60, $70, or $80,000 a year to go to college. But it's an average. On the other end of it are state public universities. If you go to the University of Texas, the University of Massachusetts, University of Virginia, and you are a resident of one of those states, they often give preferential tuition rates to people that live in those states, and you can get a perfectly good undergraduate education for, on average, if you only limit this to public state institutions, it's about half that. It already knocks off about half of the price tag. You're looking at tuition in the $10,000 range per year as opposed to the $20,000 range, and so forth. Maybe even less than that if you, depending on the state that you're in. So all things to consider under any circumstance. What else does this mean, including our situation for the coronavirus? Well, your lifetime earnings over any career with a college degree differ quite a bit based on what you choose to study, your major, what you get a degree in. And this is data that comes from the website payscale.com, and they've surveyed the workforce effectively. And each one of those tiny little lines on the graph, each one of those little bars, is a college major. And they're ranked from the most lucrative and how much money you can expect to earn over the course of your entire career. So when you graduate at age 23, 24, 22, depends on how fast you go through it, to when you retire at, let's say, age 65 or 67, how much money can you expect to earn over the course of your entire career from your salary? And that's what's associated with the majors. The one at the very top here, that's petroleum engineering, and it makes just short of $5 million on average as a career. And then it works all the way down. They tend to cluster in groups. So you can see engineering is really high, what are referred to as the STEM fields, also computer programming, economics. I always like this because I'm an economist by background. Although I don't make $5 million in terms of career earnings, it is nonetheless a very healthy career in terms of jobs and salary. And then you can see it kind of goes, it trails down a little bit. You move into some things like business degrees, other types of information, technology, some forms of civil engineering, construction, biology, medicine, nursing, even some of the humanities like philosophy, fine arts. You start to get that, and some of the further down the list as you go. Law, film studies, journalism, it makes a little bit less. And then you finally get to this point at the tail end of the chart where you see that red line, the zero line. That's not zero money that you're earning for the career. That's the break-even point. That's how much money you must make for the career to have a net positive on your expected lifetime earnings vis-a-vis, say, like a minimum wage job. And most college majors are positive, even though some are much more lucrative than others, the ones at the very far left end of the chart. But you get down to the other end of the chart, and they actually go negative. If anyone wants to guess what that very last degree, the one that's steeply negative, the thing that you should never get an undergraduate degree in, fortunately, most of you are probably not going to get an undergraduate degree in, that is a bachelor's degree in blacksmithing. Some of you probably thought you couldn't even get a bachelor's degree in blacksmithing, but sure enough, you can. I guess the only jobs for that is if you want to work in a medieval fair, medieval reenactor fair, or pioneer village, that type of a thing. But it's not a lucrative career, and what it means is that people are spending more money getting the degree itself than they are earning over the course of their lifetime. It's effectively a consumption good. There are some others in that category, and I'm not saying don't do this if you like these things. Just be aware of the careers prospects. That's stuff like theater, some fine arts, some social work and education fields are in that. But it's all available on payscale.com. I'd urge you to look that up and do so early on. Another factor: college majors are shifting in popularity. This was a study put out by the American Historical Association last year, and it measures whether college majors are increasing or decreasing in popularity. And all of the ones in that red box down at the bottom, those are the ones that are declining. They're falling in the number of majors, and everything outside of the red box, so that's a little bit shifted off, but just right above the red box, are growing in popularity. And if you notice, if you go back to that last chart, they tend to line up. The more popular majors are also the ones that pay more, that have longer and more lucrative lifetime career earnings, whereas the ones in decline tend to be contracting somewhat. Not necessarily absolute contraction, but it's something to be aware of and pay attention to when you're choosing a major. All of this matters quite a bit because we throw higher ed into the post-COVID situation, and there are some really bad options facing university administrators right now. First one that I think almost none of them are going to do because they've already exhausted this, and that is to keep their operations funded by tuition as it previously existed. Universities cannot, after this crisis, raise tuition even further, or if they do, that's almost like committing suicide because students are going to run from it. They're going to avoid it, especially in hard economic times. We know this from past recessions and depressions, but it's something to be aware of. There might be large-scale public bailouts that are being talked about, but I wouldn't bank on it because every other industry is seeking a bailout right now. That's what happens in recessions and depressions. And colleges are just going to be lining up among all the other seekers of that. And they're not necessarily the most popular recipients of bailouts. So don't bank on that. There may be pushes to offer more grants and loans to alleviate unemployment, but that was already exhausted, as I showed you in the data, in the last financial crisis. And there's also, unfortunately, some concerns about retreating into ideological corners on campus of just kind of buckling down and trying to continue doing what they were already doing before the recession, before coronavirus, and pretending effectively that nothing has changed. Well, some things are going to have to change. Some things are going to have to give. I use this picture here, and I'm not just picking on Louisiana State University, LSU, but it's just a famous example of it. This was something that colleges were spending a lot of money on up until just a year ago, just a semester ago, and that is Fancy amenities on campus. Some of you that went on campus tours probably saw this because they always highlighted on the tour. They show off the neat new facilities, that's the top of the line, state of the art facilities and on campus amenities that you get to enjoy as a student while you're there. Well, this is the Louisiana State University lazy river system where you can get on an inner tube and float around the giant LSU logo over the course of your afternoon. It's like a water park. Sounds great, sounds fun. It also costs a lot of money. And campuses across the country were doing this type of thing as a marketing mechanism to attract new students, to make themselves popular. Several built lazy rivers on campus. A lot of them built rock climbing walls, concert venues, hotel-style dorms. One that really became in vogue about a year ago. Campuses started buying up food delivery robots, these little motorized drone things. They did, not the flying ones, but the motorized carts where you enter in an order online and it drives to your dorm and gives you food. All stuff that's very neat, but it has a very high price tag. We refer to these as lifestyle amenities on campus, and they also have large staff expenditures to operate them and to build them. I'm expecting that those are going to be the first things on the higher ed chopping block in terms of budgets going forward, because now that colleges are price conscious and aware of some of the problems associated with it, they're going to pay attention to what they can cut off the bottom line. So look for campuses that have spent too much on lifestyle amenities. Those are the ones that are probably going to cut the most. A second category I want to talk about, and this is strategically something that you can think about to mitigate the coronavirus landscape in higher ed, and that is to deal with a subset of classes referred to as Gen Eds, or general education requirements. These are the classes that every student, no matter what they're majoring in, if you're majoring in physics, biology, business, English, theater, or blacksmithing, you have to take these classes. They're the core of your education, the things that are most like high school. This is, you have to take 1 semester of history, 2 semesters of writing, 1 semester of statistics, 1 semester of English, and so on down the list. The ideas that are behind it are, this will give you a well-rounded college education. Every university, except for a very few number of small, unusual structured schools, has a gen ed component to it. And what it translates into is you basically spend the first 1.5 to 2 years of your college career knocking out your gen ed requirements, courses that everyone must take. Unfortunately, the contraction in enrollment alone is probably going to mean that some smaller schools that were already teetering on financial difficulties are probably going to close their doors for good. So there's going to be fewer universities to choose from, but it's not going to be something that completely destroys universities. This is just a closing of, especially a lot of these small schools in rural New England around where I live. They basically had 200 or 300 students and very high overhead expenses. They were not in good financial shape. Coronavirus, unfortunately, may be the thing that the final blow that causes them to shutter. I want to talk a little bit more about the gen eds and where that fits into your degrees. Remember, I said gen eds roughly take up about 1.5 to 2 years of your college education. This is a breakdown that I pulled off of the website. I anonymized it, but of a very typical university degree program in America. And it's on a credit hour system. Some use slightly different metrics, but most schools that are on the credit hour systems, 1 bachelor's degree equals 120 credit hours, or really about 40 classes. So you can think of each class as usually about 3 credit hours. Sometimes they're 4 if they have a lab or something attached to it. But give or take, it's about 40 classes you have to take over the course of 4 years. So 10 classes a year. Spread it out. You may do some more some semesters than others. You may go light in some semesters and heavy in other semesters, but give or take about 10 classes a year. How do they break down? Well, the biggest component here, that's the one in purple, that's the gen ed requirements. Those are the standard math 101, history 101, English, writing, biology, the classes everyone has to take. And it may have some choice in it. You get to pick 1 fine arts, you get to pick 1 humanities, 1 social science, but everyone has to take them. These are the big classes in lecture halls where you have 100 or 200 students listening not only to a professor, but spread out across 4 or 5 teaching assistants. These are grad students that have been hired by the professor to help him or her teach their classes. Those are the Gen Ed core curriculum classes that everyone has to take. Once you're done with those, you move into your major. This is the thing you want to study and become a specialist in. If you want to become a petroleum engineer, you study engineering. You want to become a journalist, you study journalism. And you take the bulk of the classes that are interesting to you, the ones that you probably pay the most attention to in your major. Most people have a minor, and this is like a secondary interest. So a lot of people that study economics also study political science because they're closely related. They complement each other. And then everyone has electives. These are the fun classes you take just because they interest you. You may have no desire to ever again take a course in like sculpture, but college offers that opportunity and you can count it as an elective. Maybe you never want to take philosophy as a career path, but you find it interesting, you take that as an elective. And there's a little bit of variation there. But it's this first third that I'm really concerned about because that pertains that has the most significance in a coronavirus landscape for higher ed because those are the big classrooms. Those are the ones that are most likely to move online. How so? Well, it depends on how you manage your gen ed credits. And this is something I want to urge every student to think about as you're going into higher education and starting your degree. Because you have to take gen eds no matter where you go, it also means that gen eds and the credits associated with them are fairly widely transferable. An English class at the University of Texas is more or less the same as the English 101 class at the University of Iowa, the University of Florida, at Harvard, at Yale, at Princeton and Stanford, at Southwest Arkansas Technical College, at Northeastern Massachusetts Regional University. I'm making some of these latter names up, but what it implies, though, is that these courses are more or less considered the same thing no matter where you go. Now, it might differ in the quality of the course instruction of the faculty. If you're paying for an elite education at Princeton, Yale, and Stanford, oftentimes you're getting taught by a Nobel laureate or a Pulitzer Prize winner or a rock star faculty. That's a separate consideration here. The credit is roughly the same, though. What it counts for is roughly the same. But since gen eds are about a third of your college education, they're also the biggest component of the price tag and tuition that you're paying in any given year at a 4-year college or university. And you pay the same price in your English 101 credit hour as you do in your upper level international relations class that you want to take because you want to study international relations and work in that field. It's the exact same price tag. Ask yourself, in high school, did any of you take a class that you thought of as a blow-off class? You thought of as something that you didn't want to be there for, but you had to do it because you had to get the credit. And that's going to differ from every person in this seminar, every person that's attending right now. It may be a different class, but there's probably something that you thought was utterly boring and a waste of your time, and now you're done with that class, you got the grade, you hope to never do it again. But you also, on the other end of the spectrum, there are classes that you liked, that you wanted to take. You enjoyed being there. You spent more time and attention on. You studied more intensely for if you like that subject matter. It's no longer a blow-off class. Well, a lot of gen eds operate the same way. Most students invest more energy in the classes they like that are more relevant to their degree, and then they tend to kind of ignore or downplay or really, you kind of, these are the ones that you procrastinate on the assignments on, classes that are boring and not very interesting to you. Maybe you accept a lower grade than you would in your major because it doesn't matter as much to your career. A lot of those fall into the gen ed basket, and you're going to encounter those in college as well. So what I'm going to urge you to do in a post-coronavirus university situation where finances are on the strain and gen ed classes are the most likely ones to move online is to take advantage of that. Take advantage of price savings to get your gen ed requirements knocked out and therefore reduce your overall price tag on getting a college degree, and maybe even get your degree finished at a quicker pace, which means you can start your career earlier on. You can start earning money and doing what you want to do for the rest of your life earlier on. So some options for gen eds. Some of you are almost certainly taking advantage of this already, and that is advanced placement classes in high school. The ones where you take an exam and are able to exempt out of 1 or 2 semesters of the equivalent college class. There are also dual enrollment classes some of you have probably taken, where your high school class also counts for credit at the local community college. And then once you graduate high school, once you enter into higher education, you don't have to take the gen ed class at the school you're going to get your degree from if you can transfer it in. Oftentimes, the public community college in your neighborhood or in your town or city offers the same suite of classes at a third or a fourth or a fifth of the price tag of what you'd get in a typical 4-year college or university. So if you're able to take those classes there and they're online anyway, and they're easier classes, they're generic classes that are going to transfer, I'd say do it. Do it because you're going to reduce your price tag on higher ed in general. And if you start thinking about this strategically, and strategically means right now, this summer, you figure out a way to take a class online that will knock off a semester from your college experience, those things start to add up really quickly. I know tons of college seniors that are graduating right now after only 3 years in college. That's a whole year off the price tag. That's a whole $60,000 on average off of the college price tag because they went through their degree strategically and knocked off gen ed classes early on. What else can you consider? Some strategies to think about how you finance your college degree in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Well, number one, as I said, try to get your gen eds out of the way now, including with online technology that will allow you to take them for the same credit hour that would be much more expensive if you took it in the normal classroom. And if we're going to concede, online classes are less popular, but they also tend to be easier for gen eds. In other words, the way to think about it is not that you want to avoid online classes if they're inevitable, because that's what higher ed is doing. You want to save your in-person classes to the extent possible for the higher level upper division classes in your major that are more pertinent to you, more pertinent to your career. The fourth thing to think about, and this is almost certain at least for the next semester to year of higher education, is we need to accept that a lot of the on-campus amenities and college lifestyle activities that campuses are famous for will probably be diminished in the near future. This includes everything from curtailing and limiting and cutting back on sporting events on campus, fewer student life and student activity events that are being held day to day on your college campuses. Expect those to go down, but that's part of the cost saving and coronavirus pandemic mitigation strategies most colleges are going to do. But what that means for you is it probably frees up some more of your time to advance yourself further in your degree earlier on. So when colleges do resume on full schedule normal operations, whether that's 6 months to a year from now, or unfortunately, some places are talking even longer. Hopefully, it'll be relatively soon. But then you'll have more time to actually enjoy the typical college experience. And then finally, I urge everyone to pay attention to ways that you can finish your degree requirements earlier and faster. That's not only using the gen ed strategy I outlined, but selecting a major early on. I always encountered, and so I taught college for over 10 years at both the undergraduate and grad level in economics and public policy programs. And my best students were almost always the ones that figured out their major within the first year or so of their college experience. They decided what they wanted to get a career in. I know this sounds like a lot of pressure that you're going to lock yourself in what you want to do for the rest of your life. And inevitably some of you are probably going to change majors, but the people that start to think about that early on, as in right now, what you want to do with your college career, get themselves on a quicker footing to navigate the uncertainties of a degree program. The ones that kind of dilly-dally around and switch majors 3 times and start some credits toward one set of courses, but then decide they don't want to do that anymore and go to something else. These are people that often extend their college career. They're what we refer to as 5-year or 6-year seniors. Uh, that could be fun if you just want to consume the college experience, but that adds quite a bit to your price tag. So think about that and think about being strategic as you're going into your career. Final set of advice, even though COVID sounds like it's going to be something that is on everyone's minds for quite some time to come, just the absolute certainty of it is that that higher ed cannot stay closed forever. It cannot stay closed indefinitely, because that means financial ruin. The plus side, so this is the silver lining, the optimistic part of what I'm going to try and tell you to think about, is that there is an end in sight. We're just at the early stages of navigating what's happened to colleges in the wake of this crisis. And already 2 months later, colleges are better off at doing what they were trying to do in the wake of COVID than they were that panicked week when everyone tried to shut down and frantically decided to evacuate all the dorms on campus and move online. So already colleges are learning. There's a built-in learning curve to do these things in different non-traditional ways and discover the knowledge of that. That's only going to get better with time as we approach a more return to normalcy style reopening. Online ed, if you do strictly online ed, it does reduce the signal value of your degree. So this is why I'd urge you to pay close attention to the colleges you are considering, how they are accommodating traditional versus non-traditional modes of education in the wake of coronavirus. Some schools are moving entirely online. Some are trying to mitigate and split between an online and in-person presence. Look for those that do the latter. Look for those that are trying to innovate, and that may help you decide which school you go to or which school you transfer to as well. I'd also urge you, even though there's a high premium on elite institutions and universities, if you get into one that's a very high accomplishment of itself, but they are more expensive, what that means is I'd urge most students, especially the price conscious ones, is to take a second look at state schools and universities. Take a second look at commuter schools and non-elite institutions. And this can run everything from the big University of Texas, University of Missouri, massive football schools, Louisiana State University, that have tens of thousands of students at them. But there are also public institutions that are well regarded, that are basically public liberal arts colleges, small campuses with 3,000 or 4,000 students. So if you like that style, you can find it there. And then also prioritize what you're getting out of the classroom. De-emphasize the college experience. Don't be John Belushi here. This is from an old famous movie about colleges and partying at college as opposed to getting your education. And I think one of the things to take away from the coronavirus is you really do want to prioritize, at least in a time of condensed operations and financial strain, you want to prioritize what you get out of the classroom over going there to party and have a good time. There can be that experience will come at a later date as we return to normalcy, or if you want to seek out that experience in separate ways, that's entirely outside of the realm of what you should be focused on right now, though. Prioritize the classroom, because that's going to give you a leg up on your career. I know we're running up a little bit on time, but I did want to open it up to questions, comments on anything that I covered or anything else that you want to raise into the discussion. I'd be happy to entertain that right now. And I'm looking to try and switch over to the chat box. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in there, and I'd be happy to look at that. So the first one that came up, someone asks, is law a declining career choice? Because 20 or 30 years ago, everyone was saying go out and get a law degree, or get a pre-law undergraduate major so you could go to law school, because law was very adaptable to anything. You could work in the corporate world, you could defend criminal cases, you could work in civil law, you could do nonprofits, all sorts of different things that happened, which was very viable at the time. What happened is that became very lucrative and attractive for people at the time. So what happened? More people decided to pursue law degrees, and they kind of flooded the market of lawyers. So unfortunately, in the past 15 to 20 years, law school became too overheated. Too many people sought law degrees, and as a result of that, now you can't get as much of a career return out of it unless you put in really long hours. So that the attorneys that do the best with a law degree are the ones that work 60-hour work weeks at these major firms in large urban areas. So that if that's for you, it may be great to get a law degree, but if you're expecting like a more normal work week and a more relaxed lifestyle, it's probably not the most economical. So another question: will it be harder or easier to get college scholarships post-COVID? Um, to the extent that some schools are facing financial strain, unfortunately, that means they become more restrictive on their scholarships. My brother is a track and field coach at the University of Houston, and I've talked to him about this on athletic scholarships. He is already saying that the athletics department is telling everyone, and this is true of every school across the country, that you may have to tighten your belt a bit for the next few years. We don't have as much money to give for scholarships. So unfortunately, that does mean you probably are going to find greater competition and fewer opportunities. The flip side to that is need-based grants and aid from the federal government that were created in the wake of the last financial recession are still with us. Those programs are still existing, and they're more or less at their previous level, as that chart kind of showed. So think about it from that perspective. But this is also why you want to be more price conscious and focus on the benefits of in-state universities and colleges and ways to reduce your price tag. Question: do you think majoring in theater, let's see, where was it? Majoring in music and theater would be regretful down the road? I'm not going to say regretful to you, because you want to do what makes you happy. That's the end game. You want to go to college not because someone's telling you to go to college. You want to go to college because it helps you to get a job in a career that you like to do. If you are really into music and theater and you want to become a musician or an actor or work in those fields, and that makes you happy, it might be worth getting a degree in that to consume for your own personal well-being and your own personal satisfaction in life. What I am telling you, though, is just based on average, based on the statistics that we have, there's much less of a salary return, a salary premium to getting a degree in those things than there is in other fields. So if I were offering you practical advice, I'd say get a major in something else that will pay your income, that will pay the bills, and then minor in music and theater. No one's saying that you can't continue to play the violin or act in plays or participate in a band or an a cappella group on campus. Quite the contrary. You could potentially minor in all of those fields and retain that as a hobby, retain that as something you want to do, while also emerging with a degree that has better returns in the long run. Does there appear to be a decline in available external scholarships? We've got that. Let me go down the list. What are some examples of gen ed classes? Almost every student is going to have to take something referred to as Writing Composition 101, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a semester or sometimes 2 semesters of writing essays to practice your writing skills. Why? This is worked into its college curriculum. If you take an AP English, sometimes you can exempt that out of. Almost every school has a history requirement, and it's usually a survey of American history or a survey of world history. Almost every school has a hard science requirement. You may have to take just 1 semester of it, but it could be biology, physics, astronomy, geology, something like that. So these are all examples of gen ed classes. It's the thing that's most similar to your high school experience, where you go to your English class in the morning, followed by your math class, followed by your science class, followed by your history class, things like that. Higher ed has similar equivalents of it. So those are the gen eds, but they're generic. There's something that's offered everywhere. Current college loans and interest are tied up in credit score due to the pandemic and job loss. Any plans to give low interest rates for full-time students? So this is all up to the policy decisions that are out there. I'm going to say that there will be a lot of uncertainty about this going forward just because we are in a recession. This is exogenous to what colleges can control. What you can control is looking to schools and universities that have benefits for in-state tuition and things like that, or that are offering scholarships. So I'm not saying don't get student loans or that they're going to be easy to get. At the same time, credit scores are suffering because of pandemics, but interest rates have been pushed to artificial lows almost across the board as part of the intentional policy of economic stimulus on the monetary side of things. Some of that will filter over into to forms of loans for students, and other forms of loans have been subsidized by the federal government. So it may not take the hit that you're seeing in certain other sectors. What if you've already paid your housing fees and having second thoughts about attending due to COVID-19? This is a real concern. Ask the college or university. Colleges and universities are kind of navigating at the moment right now because they were not only having to deal with housing for the fall, a lot of them are having to refund housing for the remainder of the current semester because they had to send everyone home. And this is housing, meal plans, everything that you're considering on campus. And unfortunately, there's no single policy. So ask the campus, get that in writing, be certain about what it's going to entail before you pull out your checkbook and actually write that fee, because some are being more generous in refunding the money than others. And that's probably a good sign of what they're going to do in the fall. What it also means is you may want to rethink whether you want to go to a residential campus. Consider either living off campus or even going to commuter school, living at home. These are things that are maybe not ideal right now, but the one thing for yourself or for your sons and daughters to think about is you can always change that living situation in a future semester after the coronavirus issues have passed. Let's see. Can I restate some of the top careers? Well, I'd say first off, go to payscale.com because it'll give you the stuff on the majors. Anything in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Then I'd also add economics as a mathematical social sciences up there. Computers, anything with computers, those are the top careers. Healthcare is a reasonably well funded career that has been historically in high demand, and I think that demand will return after the coronavirus as well, even though it's been kind of disrupted. Healthcare has grown at astronomical rates. It's been one of the most popular majors in the past 20 years, the fastest growing in the past 20 years for a reason. Um, Business degrees are still reasonably well. It's when you start moving into things like the fine arts and the softer humanities that you really have to be set on a career in that and accepting that you're probably not going to be making as much money relative to other things you major in. So consider that. Let's see, what do we have? Do you think that the minimum wage of healthcare careers will rise after the COVID situation? I will say yes, but we don't know when. Uh, why? Because the medical industry has taken a massive disruption as a result of COVID. What they did is they tried to preserve hospital and healthcare capacity for COVID patients. That meant that they also shut down a lot of what are referred to as elective procedures. So these are normal things for long-term disease treatment. And elective doesn't mean like getting plastic surgery. It could be getting surgery for arthritis or a knee replacement. It could be surgery for early stage cancer risk. These are things that are perfectly serious healthcare considerations, but they were put on hold, put on pause as a result of trying to preserve coronavirus hospital capacity. As the pandemic passes, those things are going to resume because they do not go away. They never really went away, and people are going to be seeking those procedures, which means that healthcare jobs are probably going to be in high demand pretty soon and pretty clearly in the relatively near future. Are academic advisors encouraged to keep away from students needing to be here for 4 years? This is something that faculty are debating, and there's really a divide. There's no answer to this because we're in a period of uncertainty. What I would say is, judge your own situation, including what school you're thinking of going to. See what they're offering as options to you as a student. See how quickly they're reopening. I'd argue that schools that are committing to reopening and doing so safely in the fall and are doing so in areas that are not terribly hard hit by the pandemic are probably what most people that are risk averse should be looking at. Be thinking about schools that have plans in place to try to get back to normalcy relatively quickly, as much as is feasible and as much as we can do that well without going into unnecessary risks. But that there's a lot of variation on that right now. Even though all schools closed down, almost all schools closed down because of COVID, they're reopening at different paces. So that's the margin you want to choose on. Is double majoring in two things possible or doable? Absolutely, it's possible and doable. I know lots of people that double majored, especially if they're complementary. So as the classic one I mentioned, economics and political science, because they overlap with each other. Some of the engineering fields and mathematics overlap with each other, although that's a very intense double major. If you think you want to do that, a lot of people will start out double majoring and discover that they like one more than the other, so they'll move into a full major of one and then just choose to minor in the other. It's better to do that than to go in not having an idea. What else do we have? Will it be harder for college students to find jobs because of COVID-19? This is the billion-dollar question we're all considering right now. We do know unemployment skyrocketed after the lockdowns. 40 million people was the peak, lost their jobs because of COVID. But just in the last week, we've seen the slightest hints of positive news that we've seen in a while. Some of it came out in the jobs report today, although I was working on this as an economic analyst last week on the previous report from a few weeks ago. And two big findings that were, one is jobs are eager to rebound. They've actually started to come back at a faster pace than even most economists were predicting, as a result of easing the lockdowns, as a result of people starting to reopen. Schools and universities are still on the shutdown end of that, but retail stores have started to reopen. Some of the travel industry starting to reopen. And I think the trends are all good for that right now. What it means is that the unemployment crisis that we were seeing will still be bad, but it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. The second trend, and this is the fascinating data, I actually have some of this published on my own institution's website, aier.org. We published a series of charts yesterday that showed state-level unemployment. And the fascinating trend that emerges is the states that are reopening, that have reopening plans in places, have already started to reduce their unemployment problem at a faster rate than states that are still on various stages of lockdown. Unfortunately, my own state of Massachusetts is one of those lockdown states, but other states that have started to do the cautious, measured, or even rapid reopening are already seeing unemployment numbers drop, which I think is great news separate from the pandemic, because that shows that the economy is ready to rebound. That shows that there is some afterlife, some health that will return to it in the wake of this massive disruption. As bad as it's been, there's a silver lining. So I got a question here. Is it probable that tuition will go down drastically due to the pandemic? I don't think drastically, just because these are very sticky patterns, and plus it's also been escalating so rapidly for the past several years. But I think colleges are going to be more averse to raising tuition at the rates they were even a few years ago. I know some have already announced tuition freezes for the foreseeable future. I think it's Indiana University, Purdue is the most famous of the major large universities that's announced a tuition freeze. They're holding it in place with the knowledge that this is part of the strategy to mitigate the coronavirus pandemic. So you do have that going in your favor. Would you recommend getting credits at community college while you're planning to go out of state? I will say yes, but with a caveat: investigate where you're planning to go out of state to make sure that they accept one-for-one transfers of the courses that you're going to take. And some courses that's going to be very easy on, like writing 101, English 101 is pretty much the same everywhere, and almost everyone will accept a transfer of that. If there's slight differences in the way that they teach history, it may have less transferability. So you want to just investigate. And in most colleges, if you call the registrar, they'll send you their requirements. They'll tell you what to do. And I'm saying this not only as someone who recommends this strategy. I did this strategy myself when I was an undergrad and when I was in grad school. I picked other places where I could knock out credits for cheaper and faster, and I was able to transfer them in. And I did so even across state lines to an out-of-state institution. So it is possible. You just have to do the homework to investigate and make sure you have that approval before you take the decision, because you don't want to waste your time doing a class that doesn't transfer. Let me see if there's any other questions, because I think we've got. And then how will COVID affect transfer admissions? Okay, this is an important one that you should all pay attention to, because COVID is probably causing schools to hurt in their enrollment. It means that universities are going to be competing for transfers. They're going to be trying to draw you in, which probably means that they'll be a little easier on some of their admissions and transfer requirements. We've already seen some evidence of this. A few of the California public university systems have already announced that they're waiving SAT scores even for the next year as a way to ease the admissions process. Now, can they do this indefinitely? It's probably going to, it's an experiment that's playing out in real time, but it also signals that most universities are going to be eager to try to recruit you to come there. And that means that they're going to be more willing to work with you to get you to transfer in than they might have been in the past. And finally with that, because I think we're running out of time, what's the value of a degree from an elite school like Stanford or Yale versus other schools? Well, there are two factors there. One is elite schools do have a premium, both in the cost and in the value that they deliver. But second, that premium is much more pronounced in grad school than it is in a 4-year undergraduate college. So I always advise people, if they're going to grad school, go to the highest ranking, best ranked school that will give you funding to go there, and that may be Stanford or Yale. That's where the premium really kicks in, but those are advanced types of degrees. For undergraduate degrees, Stanford, Yale, Harvard do have premiums, relatively speaking, within the fields that you're going into, but a bachelor's degree is much more fungible than a graduate degree. So the premium's there, but it's not like an absolute premium. So keep that in mind. Keep that as something you want to think about, because if you do really well as undergraduate at the University of Texas and you want to go into graduate school, you have a 4.0 GPA and good scores, and you've demonstrated that you have the aptitude to pursue advanced degrees, that's when you make the decision to try to go to Harvard. And oftentimes, here's the other secret, if you're getting a PhD at an elite institution, almost all of those are funded. Almost all of those have scholarships attached to them. They're really competitive scholarships, but if your scores are good enough and your ranking is high enough, they will pay for your graduate school tuition in ways that your undergraduate tuition was not covered. But that's many years down the road. That's something to be thinking about in the distance. What I would urge you to do now is really investigate how colleges and universities are responding to COVID, and what's that going to do to your ease of admission, your ease of navigating the process, and your ease of getting an undergraduate degree that doesn't put you tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, because that's going to be the margin that allows you to succeed in your career faster and earlier on, and without this burden hanging over you, but also having the benefit of a college degree. I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. I will type into the public chat box my website, where you can find some of the work that I publish on higher education and economic trends in general. And then also I will type my email address. If anyone wants to send me a follow-up question, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. Put that in the chat box. And then the last bit of information, I think there is a post-seminar survey that the link is going to go live for, just to ask you for feedback, suggestions, and ideas for future panels of this type. So thank you again for joining. Stay safe out there. Best of luck to you as you make your decisions in the coming weeks and going to college and university. And I think we're all going to weather this thing. It may be slower than we expected, but the signs are already on the uptick. The signs are optimistic right now, and I think we're going to have a return to normalcy, hopefully sooner than we even imagined just a few weeks ago.